Okay, so this is the AML Book Club. We're talking with William Morris about his collection, The Darkest Abyss. Okay, and Doug has a question.
Well, I'm just wondering, Wild Branches was very interesting, all right? And I found it I found it a great read. I'm just trying to understand what's going through your mind. And you got this eccentric but semi-conventional Mormon family, or maybe not semi-conventional, and the woman comes back from Finland in a suitcase and becomes a tree, and then she just shucks off the family at the end. What's going through your mind when you're writing this? What are there any kind of inspirations there, or allegories or something?
No, I mean, I have inspirations, but not often allegories. More like concepts.
Mhm.
So, I mean, this started with the idea of a young graduate student trying to talk their way into Berkeley, basically. And the thing with the mom was, and so the idea was, okay, well, if we had this grad student, how would they try to do that? And then it became, well, what if they actually could, or what if both the reason they wanted to go into folklore studies and the way that they were going to attempt to convince this professor to advocate for them is the fact that they'd actually lived like something that could maybe be folklore or even myth. And so once I had that idea, then it becomes the idea of a like a like a like a dryad, right? Like a tree spirit. And if we have a tree spirit, where does the tree spirit come from? Well, of course, it's a Mormon missionary bringing it back from their mission. And well, how do they get the tree spirit in the country? Well, they have to bring a sapling, right? And so where are they going to plant the sapling? Well, they're going to plant the sapling in the sacred grove, of course. And then because I tend not to tell the story of, and I know this can maybe be frustrating for some readers, but I tend not to tell the kind of the origin story of the story I'm telling. I tend to like attenuate it out into something else. Um, it's less about that part of the story of kind of the relationship of the parents and more about what happens with their daughter once they settle in Hurricane. And that comes out just of me growing up in southern Utah and thinking about orchards and river rafters and the having I lived in Kanab from ages 4 to 12 and spent time in Hurricane and St. George and just the kind of the absurdity of not necessarily absurdity, but the funny thing of how, especially in the 70s and the 80s, many of the people who lived in southern Utah were either Mormon or they were kind of these crunchy granola liberal types. And so in Hurricane, you have in the mid 80s, like a vegetarian cafe. So, um, and so kind of all those elements come together and we end up with the story.
I have a
The
follow-up
ending- the
question.
ending's quite
Oh, sorry, Doug, go ahead.
Oh no, the ending is really sticks with you. It almost seems to veer into cozy horror or something by the end.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the other thing is I do not consider myself a horror writer, and don't read a ton of horror. I've read some, but I've found with quite a few of these stories is that they do verge into cozy horror or folk horror.
Okay, thank you.
And I think part of the reason is that is just because, how do I put this? Having lived much of my life in southern Utah and the San Francisco Bay Area, I don't know. I kind of grew up in areas that are ripe for folk horror, if you ask me. And so, yeah.
Why did the husband die when her tree was burned? Was he so emotionally connected with her that he burned out? He had burns?
That's something that I can't answer. That's just what happens in the story. I don't, I try to resist with a story like that. I try to resist having a super specific like answer for the mechanism. It's the same thing with, for example, like certain places. I had someone email me and say, and it was, a couple had kind of differing viewpoints, and one person thought it was about someone who was trans, and another person thought it was like a multiple realities thing. And the thing with certain places is that originally the original story idea for that was actually going to be a virtual reality story about a Mormon who moves through these various spaces and takes on these various identities as he does. And as I sat down to write it, I realized I was not interested in telling a science fictional version of that story, and that, and especially once I got through the first few paragraphs, I realized that what I needed to try to do, successful or not, is not make it science, not make it horror, not make it literary fiction, but try to situate it in such a way that it could be viewed as any of those, and be it more about the logic of the flow of the grammar of the story and with the pronouns in it, and treating the idea of these three consciousness being each other as sort of, I guess realistic is not a proper term because that's not realism, but or I should say, treat it as if it was a form of literary realism, as if it was a traditional literary story focused on interiority and what's happening with these characters, and yet have this strange element to it. And so that story resisted being genreified, even though the original idea for it was a genre idea.
Is that certain places?
Yes. Yep.
So I have a question about the last two stories that have come up. I've noted, and another story of yours, the one about the woman at the MLA conference in San Francisco. I've noticed a recurring character. I don't think it's the same person, but you have a recurring character with the female grad student. And do you know why?
Well, so they're all different characters, but there's also a novella that I wrote this year that features not a grad student, but someone who's trying to get tenure, who goes back to Utah, flies back to Utah to give a presentation at BYU on Marilyn Robinson's landscape and Marilyn Robinson's novels, and also maybe kind of interview at UVU for a position because her tenure situation at the University of Madison is a little bit iffy. And it's told in chapters, each titled after kind of the flow of a typical sacrament meeting agenda. Anyway, the figure comes up because probably because Mormons who are academics, especially if they're not successful academics, are interesting to me. And not in necessarily an autobiographical way, because for me, it was, I went to graduate school and originally I was intending to get a PhD. And I went to San Francisco State to work on a master's degree in comparative literature. And pretty quickly, I realized that I wasn't going to pursue an academic career and switched to university college marketing, and which is what I'm still in. But this idea of existing in liminal states and thinking a lot about Mormonism and the Mormon experience is obviously a persistent theme of mine and interesting to me. As to why they're often female academics and oftentimes single female academics, I don't know for sure, other than to say sometimes, well, first of all, how do I put this? I am interested in my fiction both, even though I am a very much a cis hetero male. I'm interested in writing female characters if I can, and I don't know if it's always successful, but I have had encouragement from female editors over the years for it, so that has kept me from stopping. And part of it is because to me, they're stories that I think need to be told. So there's kind of that simple answer. Part of it is because they exist in even more liminal spaces than if they were male, because of the way that the LDS Church currently treats men and women in relation to things like priesthood and the structure of the church, as well as sort of the cultural ideas around what men and women should be doing with their lives. And so that's part of it as well. Anybody else have questions or observations?
Oh,
Or
the Emma Goes West story was
yes.
interesting because I get the idea that you have done your study of how the media was back in the late 19th century and how Salt Lake could be a hotbed of gossip back and forth without things like the internet and stuff like that.
hmm
Do you, I, there seems to still be the kind of, how do you say it, competitiveness between Brigham Young and Emma Smith at even in this story. And is this how you think something might have actually happened with them? Had that ever happened in just conventional times? I'm just wondering.
No, I don't really know. I am not super well studied, unfortunately, in the life of Emma or Brigham Young, for that matter, although I've read most of the journal discourses just because I was bored after my mission the first semester of college. I didn't have a job on campus because I started college 3 days after I got back from my mission. And so I ended up just sitting in the institute reading the journal discourses. But it's more that so like that was a story where I felt like I needed one more alternate history story, or I needed an additional alternate history story in the collection. As I put the collection together, it was just didn't feel like it was completely rounded out. And I thought about, okay, what would that be? And it's hard because there are so many different directions you could go in, and I wanted to avoid anything super obvious, because I'm a bit of a weird snob that way, and also just my mind just kind of doesn't quite work that way, even when sometimes when I try to make it work that way. And so I thought, okay, well, what could be interesting? And so that again, that started with the first lines of Emma traveling west, and then from there, I realized what was interesting to me is this notion of alternative Mormonisms, but alternative Mormon states, for lack of a better term, and also someone who lived in both Utah and California for part of my life. I thought about, okay, well, what happened if a bunch and so then the whole idea became, okay, well, how do I play all these off of each other to think about different directions that things wouldn't have taken because history doesn't quite work that way, but maybe could have. And that's kind of how I arrived at that. And then of course I layered on sort of just an extra level of spookiness around Emma, partly to deal with the fact that like the timeline doesn't quite work unless she's lived quite a long time and is fairly well preserved, and partly just because I always like adding extra layers, and so that's where you end up with kind of the suggestion that maybe she's a vampire.
Yeah.
I got a real
Get back.
Wes Anderson kind of vibe from it. Like it seemed really cinematic to me, and like I could really imagine it as like the film.
Good. Yes. And yes, I mean, for me, the sentimental, the whimsical, the humorous, the tragic, and the horrifying are all often not too far from each other.
Yeah, there was a lot of open questions in that story. And I went back and read it again, and I caught a few things, and I'm still like, oh, there's still some things I'm missing. There seems to have been some kind of, and I didn't get this actually until I saw the Dave Butler blurb. I thought it was some kind of polygamy that she was doing, but he said in the blurb, his guess was that she was doing some kind of Josephite style polygamy, Nauvoo style polygamy, different from the Brigham Young style polygamy.
Correct.
So I guess this couple of secretaries were involved in that somehow. What's what?
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
the that was less about, so the secretaries are not necessarily involved. Whether they're involved with each other, I don't know. It has more to do with me, once again, playing with this idea of what polygamy is in Mormon history and the Mormon experience, but also with the idea of, okay, how would you tie all the scattered branches together if you were in the Midwest? And so that's where then the idea comes from of she looks to Brigham and thinking about this idea of tying, you know, families together, right? And so where basically you have a theological enterprise, an economic enterprise, and a familial enterprise that all get wound up in each other, and how there's both power and danger in that. And so how might she do that differently in order to bring in some of like the Stringites and some of the other splinter groups? And so that's kind of where that came from.
Okay, and minor thing.
Yeah.
She has on her card, she has the 2 pistols and the stars, and then that appears in the wrestling story too. Is there any connection there? What was that?
That's just me liking recurring images.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just, they're not necessarily connected. I will say, with the rest of Leman and Parawan, the story is a story, but you could also read it as a bit of allegory for actual like bishops in early society presence. Or maybe
another
not
recurring element.
Oh, go ahead, Kent.
Yeah, another recurring element I thought was interesting and stood out to me was the use of Brigham tea.
Yes.
And even more intriguing to me is the references to the DCC.
Yes.
Which seems like it's a little world you've created, and maybe
Yes.
there's something else that's going on with that.
So in terms of the Brigham tea, that's pure growing up in Kanab. Although I only drank it once or twice at, I think I tasted it at a July 4th celebration. Kanab had, and maybe still has, I think actually still has pretty awesome July 4th celebrations. There's a parade. When I lived there, there would be like a carnival and a festival, but there would also be sort of there would also be a Pioneer Heritage section where there'd be like, you know, I don't know, blacksmithing or trying Brigham tea or other things like that, and people dressed up. And then there'd be a demolition derby, of course, and then there would be fireworks, and the fireworks would be shot off. So everybody would like be in the fields, the playing fields and the tennis courts up towards the north end of Kanab, and the fireworks would be shot off a little bit further north, up around the canyon. And so you'd have them basically illuminating the red sandstone walls of the canyon, and then the sounds echoing off the canyon walls. So anyway, awesome.
Great.
If you could ever be in Kanab for the 4th of July, it's a great place. In terms of the DCC, yes, I've started to create a world of stories, and at some point that might be a collection in and of its own. So there are stories in the previous collection, Dark Watch and other Mormon American stories, that are part of this sort of semi-near future timeline. There are stories in the Darkest Abyss that are part of it, specifically. Certainly goes to Salt and Spirit and the first 6 dreams, and depending on how you want to look at it, maybe a sword bathed in heaven. And then Andrew has put together an anthology that will be coming out hopefully next year, and that has probably the most overt or central articulation of that world.
Okay.
So
Cool.
yeah, so look forward to that, I guess.
When I came with this collection with the idea that this was more towards the horror end of the spectrum, and then of course when I read the story with the salt mines and everything, I'm going, okay, is this a horror story for Republicans, or is this a utopia for Democrats, or what? But I love the story actually because I think it tweaks a lot of assumptions we make in Mormonism. So
yes, I've said this before, but one thing that I've realized is when it comes to fiction, insofar as I could be accused of having, you know, pointing guns or spears at people, it's always pointed both towards and out in many directions. And yeah. But part of it is also just a fascination. You know, my maternal great grandmother was an Esplin, and her parents were part of the United Order. And so part of this is also I have a certain preoccupation with the whole notion of communitarianism, with Mormonism, and so, that also pops up in my stories from time to time. But yes, it's like I said, I don't write horror, although some of these stories are obviously very clearly horror stories. But the idea was even if it was a science fiction story, I wanted to have some strange elements to it. Even if it was more towards a literary story, I wanted to have some strange elements to it. And so that's why even if it was an alternate history story, it couldn't just be an alternate history story. There also had to be something else. And that's kind of how I like to layer my fiction when I write it.
You know, I have a question. A Sword Bathed in Heaven and Uncle Porter's Revolver.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of remind me a little bit of, I'm talking to members I consider conventional, all right, consider median road, but they tend to believe that things are getting worse and we have to take perhaps drastic measures, or in the last days type of theology. I wonder if that was sort of your, a lot of your inspiration, particularly Uncle Porter's Revolver. Could see, here's a guy saying God's going to have a use for this, and it turns out to almost destroy the person. So I was wondering some insights. Is that a subtext of some of these stories?
It certainly could be. It's not what I have in mind. I never approach my stories quite that sort of politically charged. It more has to do with, well, I'll tell you what it has to do with. It has to do with that my grandfather had a Colt 45 that he got in World War II. He was in officer training school, and by the time he finished officer training school, the war was over, and he ended up instead serving in Japan for 3 years as a member of the Office of Special Services, basically a precursor to the CIA. And he basically acted as kind of like a regional or kind of rural prefect. He was his job to kind of keep order in an area of Japan and make sure that the American soldiers who were there were staying in line but also that there wasn't any Japanese insurgency happening, and just making sure that government was actually operating and things like that. Anyway, as he tells it, the officers found out that they could requisition pistols, firearms, and so they got these Colt 45s, and they got all their buddies in their class to purchase them. And then when the shipment came in, he and his two kind of collaborators on this project went through every single gun and checked them all and took the three that had the best actions, that were the smoothest, and kept them. And he still had this gun when I was living with him. I'm both fascinated. I grew up in a rural area. I am not necessarily, I have an appropriate relationship with guns, I would say. I don't own any at the current time, but I respect both self-defense and especially the use of firearms for hunting. I also hate most modern gun culture. So that's kind of neither here nor there. That's kind of just my relationship with guns. But that gun is something that I find to be such an interesting object. And so that's usually oftentimes how things start for me. It starts with like an object or an image of something. And so then I take that gun and I think about, okay, what happens with this gun? And it's like, well, what if a young Mormon man living in a urban area were to receive this gun, inherit this gun from an uncle? I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of fun, but that's kind of interesting, but what else could we add to that? And then that's where you start getting the more kind of supernatural, or however you want to define them, elements to it. And so I try to kind of complicate. And then also obviously once I start going there, then it starts tying into the whole ideas of what of things like Porter Rockwell and the Danites and the idea of holy vengeance and kind of playing with that in a modern context. So it's me again taking something and then just spinning things around it.
I guess I would be interested to know what inspired the first 6 dreams, because like my reaction is like, this is more of like a Jewish way of approaching a sacred text, and like I'd love to see some of that in our Mormon culture, but that, like, how would we even get there? I don't know.
Yes, I saw your review. Thank you for that. So I of those 4. So basically, what happened is there was a sunset panel on Mormon art, and somebody asked a question about the future of Mormon art, and the panelists gave great answers, but I wanted to give an answer, and so I did it in the way that I best know how, which is using the tools of science fiction, speculative fiction, and they were the archive was kind enough to publish, and so there was a piece that was what Mormon arts is going to look like in I think it was like 25, and then what it was going to look like in 21. Oh, I forget the exact dates. And I don't really remember where the idea came from for having the IAs. The people in the people in suspension on the generation ships comes from the DCC, the Deseret Cooperative Commune idea, right? Because I'm like, oh well, where are Mormons going to be in this time period? Well, I actually already have a timeline of where they might be. Not really, because I don't think the generation ships are actually viable from an actual scientific point of view. But anyway, it's a fun science fiction trope, and I don't exactly know where those 2 dreams that show up in the original archive post really came from, to be honest. But I couldn't stop thinking about them, and I wanted to write more of them, so I did. And then I'm like, okay, well, I need a frame story for this, because because this is not fiction in and of itself. It's just a bunch of weird dreams. And so I thought about doing the frame story, and I thought, well, wait a second. I'm missing a piece of the story here. These stories are dreamed by these artists who are in suspended animation and refined by these artificial intelligence for the use of the people who have to be on this generation ship and live and conceive children and raise children and attend to things for who knows how long, to kind of help keep them having a sense of culture and from kind of going crazy. Why don't we explore how they would react to them? And then that's where we get the, like you said, kind of the Jewish style midrash commentary on the dreams. I'm glad you appreciated that, because that's one of the more, I was just to say, it's one of the more strange stories in the collection. I don't know how to gauge the strangeness of the stories, but it's certainly one of the more. It's one that didn't have that doesn't have like a real strong antecedent that you could like point to. Like for example, A Sword Bathed in Heaven is straight up science fantasy, post-apocalyptic zombie world science fantasy. But the first 6 dreams is basically literary criticism.
Sword Bathed in Heaven was the hardest one for me to understand. Like, what is going on here? And actually knowing the story that once I figured out it's part of the DCC, because it mentions
yes
online, I said,
yes.
okay, these are people left behind. But
yes, it's the people who are left behind. Yeah, well, that was actually written for the Mormon Lit Blitz contest, and didn't make it, the science fiction contest that was held, and didn't make it as a finalist, which was fine, because it meant that I could just make it a little bit longer and play with it and put it in this collection. But I'm not surprised that it didn't make it, because like it requires a certain set of reading protocols to, I think, to really get into it. but also it's kind of also just like an old guy talking to young people, which
Um,
can, sorry,
I was just
go
trying
ahead,
to
Rachel.
remind myself of the story. And is this the one where like the AI is giving these little asides?
Yes, yes,
I thought that was kind of cute.
yes, yes. It's also supposed to be funny as well, kind of. Um, yeah.
Sister
Lo-
Greeley is a witch. Who
Uh-huh.
might have inspired you for that in your life? I'm just wondering.
Nobody in particular, but just the fact that there have been or I should put it this way. I come from a family that is very orthodox in practice, somewhat adventurous in terms of kind of, or at least open in terms of doctrine and things like that. Not certainly not rigid in relation to doctrine, but very open, especially to Latter-day Saints who were maybe more poor than most of the people in the ward, or of a different ethnicity or culture, or have a different family type than the kind of the standard and norm. And so throughout my life, I've come into contact with many people who were more on kind of the edges of wards and of the church, and also to the kind of people, especially older women, who oftentimes minister to those people. And so it's not necessarily any one particular person. In fact, almost all the details in that story are completely made up. None of them come from it, like any hint of anything biographical. Um, but but yeah, it's just from that experience of
I got the sense that you were talking about someone in more a person in Mormon history who had tremendous like nursing skills. Others might say as eccentric, in the ward. They had that kind of talent, the people.
yeah, but it also comes from the strong tradition of sort of folk magic and medicine in especially in rural Utah Mormonism. You can hear me and David Butler talk about that on the next dialogue podcast that Andrew puts out.
Thank you.
I hadn't thought about that, Doug, but yeah, she is kind of like a Mary Lee or a Peggy Sessions or something.
Mm,
To me, that was one of the stories that was easiest to say this is actual Mormonism right now. And maybe that's partially because I just finished reading all 5 Tiffany Aching books to my daughter.
Those are awesome.
Which are so good and feel like
Yes.
the same tradition of witchcraft.
Yep, absolutely.
William, before this collection came out, you spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but every once in a while you would mention it. And that's kind of my big question is like, what do you see this collection doing that we have not seen? You had been sort of pre-selling it to me over the last few years.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have picked The Elder Who Wouldn't Stop. And
Uh-huh.
so I'm
So I wanted to what does it read like if it's not in with all kind of the faithful realism stories? And so that's the simple answer for that. I just thought it was interesting. And then in terms of innovation, here's how I will put it. In stories, we've certainly had some strange stories. We've certainly had our fair share of 3D fight stories, of but I don't know that we've had as play around with things like speculative theology and speculative history. Certainly not to this extent, but also add layers and saying, okay, let's make this a little bit less genre, a little more literary, and let's.
Yeah, I think really the only stories that it reminds me
So Steve and I were in a writers group for a while, and we're kind of already on the same trajectory when we both entered the writers group, but certainly rubbed off on each other, or at least he rubbed off on me. I don't know how much I rubbed off on him. And so certainly, yeah, obviously, you know, Steve Peck and
You know, I really
but you know,
like.
there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I. Of even observed domestic relationships. You know, it certainly has plenty.
Interesting, because to me it really touches into something that's still pretty contemporary in Mormon culture. Yeah, I talked to my ancestors, so I thought that was a really timely piece for the book.
Mainline or most that the largest, probably the largest number of U.S. And you know, I like to write sweet kind of sentimental stuff as well, although you know there are aspects. Yeah, I had a lot of ancestors resemble my own ancestors, but I would love to have the chance. I don't know, but yes, I really like that story, and how to, I think modern Mormons for intersection with aspects of Mormon history and in ways that could help them navigate where we're at now. And how could that be both frustrating but also kind of wonderful?
I was afraid that was going to happen all the way through the story, even though the story.
No, come on. I mean, we actually believe there's a veil and people space, and so why not leverage the actual, you know?
Well, I'm trying to remember now. I'm like, didn't she leave the church in the story and then like she kind of didn't?
But she made it through okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would be like ceiling, which I think is a great seed for a Mormon horror story, actually.
Well, yes.
But they had that same sociability that we have here in the same
Exactly.
hang-ups. So the one grand aunt who had never been able to have children, she just couldn't take it anymore when she had kids.
Yeah.
So she had to drop out.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is if we think about, being, people, so you'll have people being, having the support of angels, and I'm like, thanks, Liz. Talk to you later. Experience. So, yeah, that's part of what I love about Mormon. Community and family ties.
Yeah, that was a favorite story of mine. Issues that relatives would have continued almost, with the different situation, but very similar. So I really like it.
You gotta have a root cellar. I don't know, man. How will it take you to make it through the winter?
I know where to find him.
But I don't think you want to answer most of them in this.
I'm always happy to answer the little questions.
The ship that goes off. Are you going to make a larger work out of that, or
Stories together, and there might be more stories than that. But I have other novels that I want to write. Are tricky because there's a lot that's already been done in that space, and also I'm not sure. I'd have to come up with an idea, and I have many other ideas that I want to attend to first. But at some point we can start with Praying Always in Heart from Dark Watch, the Dark Watch collection, and just take all the stories from there and from this and exhibit and the one from your collection and maybe others that I might write. And
so? I'm talking to you and talking to drop us in. As they say. But so, do you think it was the format kind of drove that, or was this more just your style that you like to?
I mean, it's both. I mean, I did, other than Prove Sister Greeley is a witch, each of the Norman Liplet stories that are in here, I expanded because I felt like that. I kind of like that. I kind of like the 2000. Most lit journals really like that 4 to 6 is what they really want, and I kind of like. I mean, I will have hopefully a novella and a short novel coming out straight up faithful realism and straight up straightforward plots. So for kind of that's part of the spirit of the collection.
Wanted to note that After the Fast was a very interesting read. I'm not 100% sure I understand it completely. I think I'm going to read it again, maybe a third time.
That is one of my of how would it work to be a translated being living on Earth. One of the
Was her dead body still in the house when he was making the meal? I was.
No.
Oh,
To liven up your life.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, originally that story was going to be about him like going to have a really inappropriate way to break your quote fast. I should add that it is somewhat in the spirit of this collection, but is a little bit more on to see how what folks think about that one, because I do. Yeah, a little bit more contemporary, a little bit more literary, although it also has element maybe. Anyway.
Very much appreciate it.